with some of my other colleagues pursuant to Act 31 of last session on this exact topic. So I'm using this as an opportunity to collect some ideas from this particular set of stakeholders. And I'm also interested in the perspective of others in this room. So if you hear things today that spark ideas, or you feel like there's some other ideas we should be considering or should stay away from, we definitely want to hear from you in this proceeding. So feel free to come up after this session and give me your cards. I'd be happy to send you a copy of the draft report, which will be hopefully getting out by the end of this month, fingers crossed. Here to talk with us today, we have a very esteemed panel of these gentlemen who are working right in the heart of the very quickly evolving landscape of battery storage and battery storage regulation, and some of the really new emerging opportunities that are happening nationally and in our region and in our state. First up, we're going to have Todd Olinsky-Paul of Clean Energy Group and Clean Energy States Alliance, who will give us some examples of how storage is being incorporated into some other states' energy efficiency programmatic structures, as well as some of their net metering programs. Then following Todd, we'll have Chris Rauscher, Director of Policy and Storage Market Strategy for Sunrun, where he works on Northeast and Caribbean affairs. Sounds like a nice gig. He's going to discuss what Sunrun's been doing and what they've been learning from their storage market participation around the country, which includes participation for really the first time ever in a groundbreaking way in the ISO New England regional marketplace. Last but not least, we're going to have Josh Leckie, an attorney with Downs Rockland Martin's Energy, Environmental, and Telecommunications Group. He will be helping us understand federal jurisdictional issues related to energy storage. And he's also going to zoom in on some ongoing regulatory opportunities here in Vermont to address the emergence of storage in our siting and interconnection processes. We will have a question and answer session at the end, I hope, after all three presentations, depending on time. So as you come up with your questions, jot them down, and we will take them at the end by old-fashioned raising of hands. We're not going to be using the app for this particular session. So may we have Todd come on up and help us understand what's going on in Massachusetts.
Thanks. Okay, thanks everybody. I hope you can all hear me. If you can't, then don't tell me. No, please tell me if you can. And this is be working, yes?
Bottom button, I understand.
Yeah. Raise the microphone. Raise the microphone. Is that better? Okay. All right, so thank you. Thanks, Anne. Thanks for having me. Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to be part of an esteemed panel. I'm not sure what we're also steamed about, but anyway, I should briefly introduce myself, and I'll try to get through this in a timely way. I am, as Anne said, here from Clean Energy Group and Clean Energy States Alliance. Our offices are in Montpelier. I live down the road in Williston. And the reason I'm talking about things that happened in Massachusetts is because what happened in Massachusetts over the past couple of years has a lot of relevance to what's happening right now here in Vermont, which is that energy storage is becoming incorporated into state programs and policies in various ways, made available to customers in various ways. And in particular, recently we worked very closely with the energy agencies, other stakeholders, and economists in Massachusetts to help get storage into their energy efficiency plan. This is the first time in the nation that this has been done. It was approved in January this year by the regulatory officials in Massachusetts, and it's a 3-year plan, so we'll see how that plays out over 3 years before the next generation of that plan is put in place. So much of what I'm going to say is in a report that we published in April. It's available on our website for free if you'd like to take a look. It basically does 4 things. It explains how this was done in Massachusetts and how other states can approach the same issues, learning from some of the lessons from Massachusetts. It discusses issues and best practices in battery incentive design. It introduces storage cost-benefit analysis, which is a very important part of getting batteries or any other measure into an efficiency program or any other kind of state incentive program where you have to show that whatever measure you're supporting passes a basic cost-benefit test. And it assigns for the first time some actual dollar values to 7 non-energy benefits of energy storage that weren't included in the cost-benefit test, but probably should be in the future. Before I go forward, I want to note, as many of you are aware, Vermont's efficiency program is different from that of Massachusetts in a very important way. Vermont has Efficiency Vermont, essentially an efficiency utility that administers the program here. In Massachusetts, on the other hand, efficiency program administrators are the utilities. So there, the storage or whatever else you put into the efficiency program is offered through the utilities to the customers. Here it would be through, presumably, Efficiency Vermont. So in Massachusetts, there were 2 requirements that needed to be met in order to get storage into the efficiency program. First, efficiency had to be redefined. And secondly, we had to show that storage was cost-effective as a requirement to get it into the program. Now, redefining efficiency had already, in fact, been done legislatively in Massachusetts, so that part was easy. But I'm going to go through it very briefly so you understand what I'm talking about here. The key concept here is that not all load hours are valued the same way. And so what that means effectively is that not all electrons have the same value. Because up until now, we really haven't had a way to store electricity. We generate it at the same time as the demand exists. And in that instant where demand increases, we have to increase generation. In the instant where demand decreases, we have to decrease generation to keep the grid in balance. Traditionally, electrical efficiency has been thought of as a simple reduction of consumption. Net consumption goes down, you've increased efficiency, and that's fine. In Massachusetts, that definition was expanded by adding the concept of peak demand reduction. And what that means is that you're not necessarily reducing net consumption, but what you're doing is you're shifting it from times of high demand to times of low demand, okay? You may not reduce overall consumption at all in this process, but you are flattening the curve, the load curve. And that has an enormous effect across the grid of increasing efficiencies. And I'm going to tell you why that is. This is the demand curve for Massachusetts for a year. As you can see, the peaks come mostly in the summer when everybody has their air conditioning on. That's the middle of this graph. And those peak hours, according to a study done by the state of Massachusetts, those 10% of the total hours in the year account for 40% of the annual cost of electricity across the year. So that means that every hour during the very narrow peak periods is incredibly expensive because you're paying for resources that only run during peak periods. They're called peaker plants. And that makes reducing those peaks by shifting generation very valuable. Also, in addition, the white space in this chart is the inefficiency in the system. So if you look at this, when you think about it, the entire grid, all the elements of the grid, generation, transmission, distribution, et cetera, are sized to meet those occasional peaks. They have to be, or you'd have blackouts in the summer. So because they're sized to meet those peaks, during non-peak times, much of that capacity is sitting idle. That means you have an overcapacity situation during much of the year, and that means you're essentially wasting resources during much of the year. You've invested money in things that are just doing nothing. By flattening the peaks and taking over-generation during low peak times and applying it to high peak times, you can reduce this inefficiency in the system, and that creates value. So, I mentioned this was done in Massachusetts legislatively. Back in 2008, the Green Communities Act said that the efficiency program should seek to incorporate all available energy efficiency and demand reduction resources. And that's what storage is in this context. It's a demand reduction resource. I won't go through all the various legislative initiatives since then, but this has been refined, and and strengthened to the point where in 2018, the Act 2 Advanced Clean Energy stated specifically that energy storage systems providing sustainable peak load reductions behind a customer's meter should be included in the efficiency program. By the way, Vermont, I believe, already incorporates peak demand reduction as an efficiency goal in the efficiency program, so that part is kind of already in place. So I said there were two essential features here. The second being that you have to show storage as a cost-effective way to manage these demand peaks. Otherwise, it doesn't pass muster and it doesn't get included. Different states use different cost-effectiveness tests. Massachusetts uses the total resource cost test. Vermont uses the societal cost test. Other states use other tests. What we did was, since no one had done the cost-benefit analysis for behind-the-meter storage in Massachusetts, we went out and hired or contracted with an independent economic consultant, and we had them do it. We used the same TRC test that is used for every other measure in the Massachusetts efficiency program. The results are that the benefit cost ratio for low-income customer storage was 2.8, and for C&I, which is commercial, was 3.4. So that means that for every dollar you spend on storage behind the meter that's used to reduce peak demands in Massachusetts, you're getting between $2.8 and $3.4 of benefits in return, just from peak reduction. And this doesn't include other benefits the customer may realize, such as resiliency and so forth. Now, the utilities, the program administrators, went ahead after we did this and did their own analysis and came up with very similar numbers. But I do want to call your attention to two things here. One is that there's a donut hole in the middle. The middle tier here is the low-income portion of the efficiency plan. They didn't even do the calculation for a low-income sector. In Massachusetts, there are three sectors in the efficiency plan: residential, commercial, industrial, and low income. And for some reason, the utilities decided that it wasn't really necessary to do this for the low-income sector. So we don't know what their numbers would have looked like, but we think this is a critical omission, and we hope that other states will avoid this, because the people who are in that low-income sector really need the cost savings and resiliency benefits of storage the most, and shouldn't be left behind. I also want to mention that since that time, there have been several other cost-benefit analyses done on behind-the-meter storage. And interestingly, the numbers really aren't that different. You look at our numbers with AEC, which is the economists that we contracted with, 2.8 to 3.4, and then look at the Massachusetts program administrators, which found benefits of 0 to 6.2 ratio. Connecticut Green Bank did this recently. They came up with around 2 to 4.5. And then San Francisco Department of Environment did a study on resilience projects only and came up with something between 0.5 and 2.6. What's remarkable about that to me is not that they're different, but that they're so similar, which indicates to me that there's pretty good, robust analysis going on here, and that behind-the-meter storage does in fact make sense, dollars and cents, to do. And those numbers will probably improve. Thank you. Those numbers will probably improve because A, cost of storage is coming down, and B, there are numerous benefits of storage that were not included in these analyses, and I'll get to that in a minute. So the results of all this work in Massachusetts, I already mentioned, the efficiency plan now includes storage. We are anticipating about $13 million worth of incentive payments to customers through that plan over 3 years in Massachusetts, resulting in somewhere around 34 megawatts of new behind-the-meter storage being deployed in Massachusetts during that period. There are obviously shortcomings. I mentioned the low-income customers seem to have been omitted to some degree. There's no upfront rebate, which would certainly help in defraying upfront investments for customers, although there is a no-cost loan program that they can access. And the storage benefit cost ratios are likely way too low considering all the benefits that were left out of those calculations. This is an example of compensation rates from National Grid. This is a current program under the efficiency plan. A commercial customer in Massachusetts can sign up for $200 per kilowatt summer performance payment. And essentially what that means is that based on the capacity you're able to dispatch in response to a utility signal, you get paid on a per kilowatt basis for the load reduction that you've achieved. I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but it's a fairly good program from the customer's perspective. Economics example, if you're a commercial customer, you have a 60 kilowatt battery, there is a 3-hour dispatch call, so that 60 kilowatt hour capacity gets divided by 3 across those 3 hours. So that means your average load reduction is going to be 20 kilowatts for that 3-hour call, average per hour. Multiplied by a $200 incentive rate is about $4,000 maximum payout. And that would be, thank you. That would be just to illustrate that the duration of discharge matters. So if the utility said, well, we're going to call for a 2-hour discharge instead of a 3-hour discharge for those peak periods, that would mean that your average would increase and you would expect to get a $6,000 payout as opposed to $4,000. So as a customer, the duration of those discharge calls is very important. I want to mention that incorporating new technologies into energy efficiency plans is a best practice, according to the US EPA. We're constantly doing this. We incorporate new types of lighting, we incorporate new types of appliances, we incorporate new types of weather stripping. It's done all the time. This is just the next step in that process. I also want to point out that this process is to some degree part of a much larger evolution that started right here in Vermont with the McKnight Lane redevelopment project in Waltham. 14 affordable housing units, each with solar and storage. We worked with GMP on this a couple of years back. Based on that pilot, they developed their Tesla program, their Bring Your Own Device program, their Resilient Home program, et cetera, et cetera. Based on their programs, Liberty Utilities in New Hampshire has a pilot for residential behind-the-meter storage now. Also, National Grid and Eversource in Massachusetts are doing this in 4 different states. And so now we have a docket here where we're trying to have our regulatory structure catch up with what we've already done in the field, and here we are. So, why is this important to do through efficiency programs? There are about $9 billion in state energy efficiency money across the country. Vermont, $150 million in the efficiency plan. Massachusetts, $2 billion plus in the efficiency plan. This is a large source of resources. And for a new technology like energy storage, it's very important to be able to access the resources that are available to other efficiency measures on a level playing field. I already talked about the differences in Vermont's programs, so I'll skip this. I also already mentioned that demand reduction is included in the efficiency plan here as a concept, so I'll skip this in the interest of time because I want to get to net metering very briefly and suggested that I cover this. When you start putting batteries behind meters, you find that a lot of people who have solar also want to have batteries. And this can cause issues to arise in net metering because in net metering you're exporting from your solar panel onto the grid. You don't want to export grid power that you've stored in your battery back onto the grid, getting a net metering credit for that if it's not actually solar generated. This raises problems for utilities and utility regulators. This has been dealt with effectively. It's been dealt with in California. It's been dealt with in Massachusetts. There is no reason to reinvent the wheel here in Vermont or anywhere else. When net metering issues arise, we should look at lessons learned from these other states, okay? And there are a set of best practices, and you can go and look at the dockets and how that was resolved. Essentially, you just need to keep track of the electrons and make sure that you know what's going where. It isn't that complicated, and as GMP has illustrated recently, you probably don't even need meters to do this. You can take the data off the inverter. It's much cheaper. that concludes my presentation. And are we taking questions after everybody?
At the very end.
Okay. Thank you very much. I will be available here.
Guys, there's like 8 seats down here if anyone wants to come and sit down. How do I advance?
Should be able to use the clicker or.
Does that work? That works. Okay, great. Morning, everyone, and thanks for having me here in Vermont. I love coming to the REV conference every year. It's a beautiful time to be in Vermont. As Ann mentioned, I work for Sunrun, mostly in the Northeast and mostly in the Caribbean, and I try to line that up as seasonal work. Doesn't actually work that way at all. So Sunrun, we're the country's largest residential solar storage and home energy management company, 22 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. And we have a really active and robust policy team throughout the country, including here in Vermont. And we entered the Vermont market with our solar products a couple of years ago and with our Solar Plus storage product earlier this summer, something that I'm really proud of. So here are some of the headlines on Sunrun over the last couple of years. And I think what I'm going to do is, my presentation's rather long, but I'm going to move fast through it and sort of zoom out a little bit and show the national context of storage regulation through Sunrun's projects around the country here. So we started in Hawaii with our Solar Plus storage product, which we call Brightbox, and that was because the penetration of solar in Hawaii became very high. I think Vermont actually per capita has the second highest in the country after Hawaii, which is pretty incredible. And the regulators there chose to manage that by getting rid of net metering, which probably was not the most efficient and cost-effective way to do that. But in response, we were able to bring our battery product there so that we could have solar for our customers after dark. I think it's really important to keep in mind that Hawaii is the only state in the country where getting rid of net metering would allow companies and people to bring storage to the market, and that's because the retail rates are so high. They range from 25 at the low end to in the 30s when fuel prices go high. So any other market and every other market that we have seen where net metering goes away, solar is not brought to the market. The solar market just shuts down. Next, we went to California with our battery product, where we initially helped create the duck curve over the last decade or so. And then we brought batteries to help solve for the duck curve. And a lot of people frame the duck curve as a problem, but I actually think it's not a problem so much as a motivating factor to make the grid smarter and more efficient. And then we went to Texas in the ERCOT market. They don't have net metering in Texas, so we paired with retailers and brought what we call virtual net metering, where the retailers take some of the attributes and play in the ERCOT market, and our customers, our residential customers, receive the benefit of backup power and bill savings. And I should have said at the outset too that all of our customers, all of our Solar Plus storage customers, have backup power from the battery, so the home will isolate off from the grid in the event of an outage. So I think today is a particularly poignant day to be talking about this, because right now, this very moment, up to 1 million people in California don't have power because of the proactive shutoffs, primarily in PG&E territory, which is completely astounding when you think in terms of the safety of people who need consistent electricity to power medical devices or to keep insulin cold, or to charge wheelchairs, and also the economic drag on the California economy. And then, so, I also have a lot of experience working in Puerto Rico as well, which is sort of the other end of what can happen with both our climate crisis and with the sort of need for change in the utility business model. Both the physical infrastructure and then the institutional infrastructure of the utility were completely wiped out as a consequence of Hurricane Maria. And then here in the Northeast, as you all know, we had frequent outages, primarily from nor'easters and then from hurricanes. Was it Hurricane Irene a couple years ago here in Vermont? Yeah. So we are, at Sunrun and then across the industry, rising to the challenge here in a way that I don't think we would have been ready to do 5 years ago even, because the battery product has really reached a level of maturity now. So in Puerto Rico, we responded by doing nonprofit installations on fire stations to bring critical communications equipment online right after the hurricane, and I was really proud to be part of the crew that went down. And then since we've entered the Puerto Rico market, direct to customer, and Puerto Rico and Hawaii are the only 2 markets for Sunrun where we don't offer standalone solar at all. It's all paired with batteries. And then the Western wildfires, today we have, I can't give the exact figure, but in the thousands, we have thousands of families today that have power from our solar and battery systems, and they don't have power from the grid. And then nor'easters and aging infrastructure here. So I think this is a slide that is really incredible to me. Last quarter, which was I think maybe the 3rd quarter total, where residential storage deployment outpaced all other market segments. So when you add up all the utility scale deployments and then the C&I deployments, residential deployments were larger in terms of capacity. So we do tiny little batteries, we do them one at a time, but we do them really fast. And when you put them all together, that creates a very large fleet that's out there on the grid, larger in fact than the other segments. And I think another really interesting thing from this report is that 95% of those residential storage deployments were paired with solar. So solar policy, and I'll get into this later, but solar policy equals storage policy today and for the foreseeable future. So sort of going back to the Sunrun story here, as we build out this fleet on the grid, we are really sort of leaning into the power of our networks. And one of the things we're doing is we're putting out proactive policy pieces showing that if we leverage this fleet that we're building out, we can replace either traditional infrastructure that's on the grid today or the need to build new infrastructure. So in LADWP, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, we've done modeling that shows with 75,000 solar and battery homes, we can replace a 300 megawatt gas peaker plant. And RFPs will be out soon to do just that. So we call this either virtual power plants in some cases or non-wires alternative. I hate both of those terms, and we're going to have to come up with new terms because there's nothing virtual about what we're doing with these aggregations, and they're really not acting as power plants in many cases. And same thing with non-wires alternatives. It gets confused with the early 90s hip-hop group. And then coming back to the Northeast here, the Northeast is really leading with bring your own device programs, which started in Vermont. You all may think that Vermont has better exports. I think the BYOD programs are probably the best thing to ever come out of the state. And really, what it is it's
better than craft beer.
Better than maple syrup. Maybe. What it's doing is it's combining the core competencies of the utility and third parties like Sunrun. So the utility identifies a need. So in this case here in Vermont, it's monthly and yearly peaks. So the transmission peaks every month and the capacity market peaks every year. Creates a program to allow companies like mine or individual homeowners to enroll batteries, and then GMP predicts the peak, sends out a dispatch signal. We discharge our batteries, our fleet, and we provide the measurement verification to Green Mountain Power and then receive a revenue stream. This really works well for a number of reasons. It removes the complexity for the customers. So, most of our customers are middle-class families. They're busy. They don't have any knowledge of energy. We do third-party ownership, so primarily PPAs and leases. So we offer our systems to people who don't have $30,000 lying around to spend up front. So it removes complexity from our customers. It also removes risk to the utility rate base because we're financing the assets. There's nothing coming out of the rate base. And here in Green Mountain Power territory, we're in BED territory today, but in Green Mountain Power territory, it's all pay for performance. So we only get paid when our fleets actually provide the savings to the rate base. The other side of the coin, which Ann mentioned, is direct to the capacity market, which we did last year. We put in a bid in the Ford FCA 13, the 13th capacity auction. This represents about, sorry, you meant to take a picture. Do you want me to go back one slide here? You got it? This represents about 5,000 individual homes across New England and 4 different states. And that's with today's typical battery, but because this is a forward market, we have 3 years to build out the fleet, so likely there'll be larger batteries that we use. Customers, of course, will get backup power as they do with any program that we participate in. They get savings from the solar as well, and a share of the capacity market revenue. And there's 2 different ways that so whenever we put customers' batteries into a grid services program, whether that's bring your own device or the forward capacity auction, we share that revenue with the customer, and that's either lower upfront pricing, lower monthly pricing, or a yearly performance payment. Moving forward in time, we now have a contract with the East Bay Community Energy CCA in California to directly replace a kerosene-fueled peaking power plant just outside of San Francisco. If you can believe that, they have a kerosene peaker there. And then coming back to Hawaii, the most recent thing that we announced is that we were part of winners on an RFP to do a number of different services. We won a contract for about 1,000 homes where we're going to do autonomous fast frequency response on the grid. And to me, this is really cool. For a lot of our other programs that we're participating in, we receive a signal from the utility, and that could be a text message, right? Or it could be a phone call, or it could be all the way up to API integration where we get a software signal. That signal goes to our network operations center in Denver, and we dispatch the fleet. And sometimes that's all completely on the back end without human involvement, but other times it's just a text message and then we dispatch. In Hawaii, part of this contract is our inverters and our batteries are out doing autonomous fast frequency response. So when the frequency on the grid drops, we help to raise the frequency, and I think that's really innovative. So getting to sort of the regulatory roundup here, I think we need to take the Hippocratic approach, which is first, do no harm. There are a number of market structures both in the region and around the country that are really driving storage build out, and we can get into this in the conversation portion a little bit more. As Todd mentioned, in Massachusetts, there were a number of hurdles that we had to clear out through DPU dockets, and that really slowed down the market by a year and a half, and some of those pain points are still in existence today. Fortunately, the DPU in Massachusetts came out with an order last week that kind of, I think, is putting utilities on notice that if they block solar deployment, they're going against the Baker administration. And then, so we've got this sort of like regulatory programs that are driving markets, and we also have some of the hurdles, interconnection and metering. So there, utility, Green Mountain Power and the other utilities in Vermont, I think, are some of the most proactive utilities in the country in terms of integrating storage. So we're not experiencing a lot of this here, but in other states, particularly Massachusetts, we are. Interconnection, simple things like, are you counting the combined capacity of the solar plus the storage for interconnection screens? There's so many reasons why you shouldn't do that, or why the utility should look a little bit deeper to do that. Other things in interconnection, like if you have a saturated circuit, saying that you cannot install solar and storage in that circuit. Well, actually, if you install storage and then you have a charge-discharge profile, that's right. You can actually increase the ability of that circuit to host more solar. And then metering, we really need to move forward into the future to do inverter-based metering rather than physical utility meters. If our inverters can do autonomous fast frequency response, they can count the kilowatt hours coming out of the solar. And then here, the role of the utility. I think that utility ownership behind the meter is not going to be the trend around the country. We're not really seeing that anywhere besides Vermont. I think Green Mountain Power is one of the most innovative utilities in the country, certainly, but other utilities I don't think are going to go down that route. So what are we talking about here, role of utility? It's the competitive pipeline versus the utility opportunity pipeline. So one example is in New Hampshire, Eversource has proposed isolating a town called Westmoreland that has frequent outages and a faulty line that runs there. And they want to put a big front-of-the-meter utility battery to back up the entire town for when the line goes down, and then also bring their own device program to back up individual customers and then allow the size of the utility battery to be smaller because those customers will be basically dropping their demand off of the grid. But the utility battery is something like, I don't remember what it is, 50 megawatts or something, and they've proposed five residential customers for the Bring Your Own Device program, which no company can go to Westmoreland, New Hampshire, and pursue a market opportunity for 5 customers. So I think we really are going to move away from the issue of utility ownership and start talking about the opportunity pipeline. Building requirements, fire code is something that's coming up over and over in different states, and fortunately we found most fire departments to be pretty proactive on this. There are really good national regimes, and as Todd was saying, for most of these things, including fire code, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. This has been solved in a lot of places. And also just keeping in mind that there's a lot of lithium ion already in people's houses and businesses, from our power tools to lawnmowers to electric vehicles, cell phones, computers. In fact, I was in Boston on Tuesday, sitting with someone from the Boston Fire Department, and they had a lithium-ion fire in their firehouse caused by a drill. Right? So when we look at permitting regimes for stationary storage, we have to keep in mind that there's already a lot of batteries out there, and stationary storage is probably one of the safest due to enclosures and all of our fire testing. And then opening pathways, particularly in the wholesale market, that's something that we are really focused on at Sunrun. This is my last slide here. This is what I'll leave you with. It's a lot of text, but the basic takeaway is that in the region, through the ISO New England market, we're already seeing savings from all of the, what I'll call passive solar that's on the grid. And this is because most of our peak, well, all of our peak days, all of our peak hours in the region are occurring in the summer while the sun is still out, right? And this past peak day, July 30th, which, as you all recall, was extremely hot and humid, that would have been, the peak would have been 1,000 megawatts higher that day, but for the solar that's out on the grid. And that solar is currently not being compensated directly through the wholesale market. Most of it's being compensated through net metering. Solar paired with storage is going to produce even more savings going forward, especially as that peak changes and we can shift the solar to after dark. And in fact, for our ISO bid, we have a commitment period in the wintertime that is after dark. So we will be sending stored solar onto the grid in the dark. So it's a little catchphrasey, but at Sunrun, we like to say that solar is the engine of storage, and net metering is the engine of solar. So today and for the foreseeable future, solar policy is storage policy. And I think that's something that we really need to keep in mind as we look to advance regulations on storage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As Ann mentioned, my name is Josh Leckie. I'm an attorney with DRM, work with clients on project siting, regulatory compliance, energy transactions. Chris and Todd did a great job of giving an overview of kind of what's going on in the region and across the country, different ways states are looking to incentivize the rollout of storage. I'm going to bring the focus kind of here on Vermont, focus more kind of on the nuts and bolts permitting requirements, and then also take a look at what's going on at the federal level, and if there are any implications there. There have been opportunities created at the federal level, but it's always good to be mindful of potential implications that could arise if you take advantage of those. So, as I said, today's focus, going to look at Vermont's storage permitting obligations, Vermont's net metering and interconnection rules. They are evolving. There are opportunities to kind of engage in both of those spheres, and for storage to play a role. And then the federal implications coming out of FERC Order 841, which are not established, they're not set in stone. There's still ongoing proceedings, ongoing litigation, but we can at least look at what's going on now currently. So here in Vermont, unlike traditional renewable energy siting, storage, you're going to see significant variation across a variety of use cases. So with your classic solar or wind project, it's very clear. You're subject to the Public Utility Commission's jurisdiction. You need to get some sort of approval, say a certificate of public good under Section 248, and that's kind of your clear path. With storage, that isn't the case currently. So just to give you an idea of how these can play out, down at the lower left, you see kind of a typical residential system. The upper left is GMP's Stafford Hill project over in Rutland. It's a solar plus storage project, provides backup power to an emergency shelter, but it's also being used to shade peaks. The one there in the middle top is the King Street Youth Center project over in Burlington that was deployed to reduce a customer's demand charges. And the one on the far right is the most recent of the group, is a standalone storage project in Heinsberg that was developed in collaboration with the interconnecting utility. And there's a partnership where the project is being deployed to reduce the utility speeds, but then the asset owner can also participate in the ISO New England markets when it's not being used for that purpose. So as I said, all of these are kind of going to experience a different sort of permitting review. We did receive some clarity this past session, as Ann had mentioned. In Act 31 of 2019, the Vermont legislature made clear that a CPG is required for an exporting storage system that is equal to or greater than 500 kW in size. And that's kind of the power side of the capacity, not the energy side with the kilowatt hours. So that's clear. Act 31 left, several significant open questions, which Ann and her team are working to resolve, and will offer the State House some quality recommendations on how to, we want to draft rules and statutes with the eye towards encouraging the rollout of these systems, because they provide system-wide benefits to participants and non-participants alike. Kind of looking at the standalone storage use case, that Heinsberg example that I mentioned, when you're not partnered with the renewable asset, it raises interesting questions under Vermont's traditional utility regulation requirements. So if you're a solar project or a wind project, you're a qualifying facility under federal law. You're a QF, and that comes with certain advantages. Under federal law, you are exempt from traditional utility regulation, which would include having to get pre-approval when a company is looking to acquire a project, or if you're mortgaging or pledging corporate property, or if you're selling or leasing corporate property. Typical utilities all have to go before the Public Utility Commission and receive approval before they enter into those sorts of transactions, because they have a captive rate base, they have ratepayers, and the regulators want to make sure that these are prudent decisions. For your classic renewable project, that's a merchant plant. It's not owned by a utility. You qualify for this QF exemption. You don't have to deal with any of that. It allows you to move forward with those sorts of transactions without that sort of regulatory review. For standalone storage, you don't necessarily qualify as a qualifying facility. You don't enjoy those same benefits. There's limited precedent out there at the federal level. One of the cases that from several decades ago that did look into this issue said, in order to determine whether storage meets the requirements for a qualifying facility, you have to look at the energy source that is actually powering the storage unit. So in the case of a standalone project, you're looking at the grid power. Now that grid power doesn't meet the PURPA requirements for a qualifying facility, so it wouldn't qualify. And that's the case of this standalone storage example. So in that Heinsberg case, which is case 18-3088, in recognition that those traditional requirements would apply, we worked with the developer to get a waiver from them. So we went before the Public Utility Commission, pointed out the fact that this was a private project, there are not ratepayers' interests at stake, it's not being financed with any utility money, and kind of built on some existing precedent that had been applied to hydro facilities and transmission facilities to make the case that the PUC should kind of give a fairly broad waiver. And we were successful there, and the Commission did. You still had to go before then we get what's called a Section 231 CPG. It's essentially a business license to do business in the state. They're looking at your competence, your financial abilities. You still needed to obtain one of those, something that solar facilities typically don't need to obtain. But otherwise, moving forward, this project wasn't going to be subject to that kind of heightened scrutiny. There was another example where we worked with on the Berry project, which is in GMP service territory, where similar case where it's a standalone project. That one has not been built yet, but I believe it is moving along in that direction. And again, the PUC granted all the waiver requests. And why does this matter? We have established precedent where if you make the case, you can get these waivers, but it's just an inefficiency in the process. If the Public Utility Commission has recognized that this level of review is not appropriate for these private projects, then it should just be stated in the statutes or in the rules, so you don't need to go through the process of filing motions and adding up your costs of your development of the project. So another use case would be a storage retrofit, where you have an existing solar project and you're looking to add storage onto it. You can perhaps go with a new approval, a new standalone certificate of public good, or maybe you need to amend your CPG, or you make the case that this is really a non-substantial addition to this existing project. It doesn't require any sort of approval. And whether you're going to go down one of those various routes kind of depends in part on the ownership of the system. So I have here as an example the Panton storage project. I was not directly involved with this case, but it was a GMP storage asset that was co-located with a GMP solar project. But the ownership was the ownership did not exactly line up. The solar project was a joint venture between GMP and a tax equity partner, financed through a partnership flip arrangement, whereas the storage project was really just a GMP asset. And if you looked at the filings in there, you could tell that the storage project was really being put forward as a separate facility. So in that case, GMP sought a separate CPG for the project. It did not attempt to amend the existing one or argue it was a non-substantial change. And I think in the case where you have joint ownership, or you have, say, someone who has built a net metering project and they're looking to add on storage to create some additional revenue streams. If it's common ownership, I think then the case is much stronger that you would just look to work off the existing CPG, perhaps argue it's not substantial because the footprint of these projects is exceedingly small. Even the Heinsberg one, for instance, which was 1.9 megawatt, 5.3 megawatt hour system, it only occupied 1/10 of an acre. So these are exceptionally small projects with very limited impacts, which it doesn't really seem like it's a good use of the commission's time or the agency's time to actually review these particular additions. Kind of moving on, I guess another example would be a storage solar project, brand new proposal. There you're just you're under the classic Section 248 process. You're not there. You also get to qualify for those exemptions as a qualifying facility because you're assuming that your storage is being powered exclusively with the solar. Then that would be very clear. And then that kind of gets us to where we have some open questions after Act 31. Your commercial / residential scale projects that are under 500 kW in size. Those you are not required to go before the Public Utility Commission currently because Act 31 does not capture them. But you need to be mindful of whether Act 250 or local review would potentially apply. I mean, one of them will. Vermont's not going to let you escape regulatory review. I mean, you're going to be before Act 250 if you're not before PUC. Now, there could be a chance if the project is small at this scale, there may not be much in the way of review at the Act 250 level or the local level, or perhaps if you wanted to confirm that, you could ask for a jurisdictional opinion from the district commissioner at the under Act 250, just to verify that adding this 400 kilowatt storage unit to an existing development doesn't require some independent level of approval. And then I have a note here, which I'm sure most of the folks in this room are well aware of. Just you don't want to forget about the Department of Public Safety. So pretty much any time you are installing storage in what's called a public building under the statute, which would be anything except for single-family owner-occupied homes. So if you're putting storage in a duplex or an apartment building or a commercial space, you're going to trigger the Department of Public Safety's jurisdiction. You need to be mindful of any building permits or electrical permits that you may need to obtain. So Act 31, there are some open questions, but we have opportunities for reform. I'd say given how the Public Utility Commission handled the Heinsberg project and the Berry project, it would make a lot of sense just to drop that exemption from utility regulation right into the statutes. The existing exemption is in the PUC's rules for PURPA under Rule 4.400, but you could essentially mirror that language and include it in the statute to be clear that when a project is not being financed or owned by a traditional utility, you should not be subject to these types of financing and corporate level reviews. Along similar lines, should also clarify the exclusion from Act 250 and local review. So if you are a project that has to go before the PUC, it should be very clear that you're then exempt from Act 250 and local. Now that's presently the case for electric generation, electric transmission, natural gas, telecom. We have it right in our statutes where it says that if you're if you're one of those facilities and you need to go before the Public Utility Commission, then you're exempt from Act 250 and you're exempt from local. And consistent with that treatment, we should have some clarifying language dropped into those statutes that would treat storage the same. As far as what kind of review process we'd be looking for if you are before the Public Utility Commission, I think we can look to expand on the simplified procedures that apply to renewable facilities. So 30 VSA Section 8007 was a legislative directive to the PUC to adopt simplified procedures, consider whether some of the notice requirements or some of the various statutory criteria are really necessary for these small projects. And it also establishes that projects that are 150 kW and smaller, even if you're not participating in the net metering program, you still qualify for that kind of net metering level of review. And it would make sense to build on that language to include storage. Not to suggest that storage should be treated identically to these small renewable plants, because again, storage has a much smaller footprint, much smaller impacts from an aesthetic perspective or a natural resource perspective. So it may make sense to even have a much more circumscribed review for these projects, but I think 8007 gives us a good starting point for how to address storage's unique review process. When we're looking at commercial retrofits, I think again, looking at existing practices, the minor amendment process under the net metering program is a good example that I think would work well here. For those minor amendments, if you are making a change within 50 feet of the approved limits of disturbance, you essentially just file a notice that attests to that fact, and there's a 10-day period where folks can object, and if there's no objection, your change is deemed approved. It's very efficient. Absent that kind of process, you need to file a much more formal request to ask the PUC to issue an order determining that the change is non-substantial. So I think it would make sense for the PUC to adopt that minor amendment process for storage, where if you're going to include storage at an existing site within 50 feet or so, you can file a notification and it would be deemed approved after a certain period of time. And when we're talking down at the residential scale, if there's anything that's necessary at all, I'd say it should just be merely a notification process that just lets the utility and the department and the PUC have eyes on kind of what's coming online at the residential scale. It could be good for reporting processes or kind of tracking our progress to meet certain goals, but it doesn't seem like there should be any need for much more review beyond that. So I have a whole lot of time left, but I'll just mention, like I said at the outset, under the net metering rule. The PUC has an active case going now where it's considering changes to the program. And I think it's important that we consider ways to leverage the net metering program to realize these system-wide benefits. And the cleanest approach, in my mind, would be through a storage adder, where if you are deploying your storage asset at certain times of day to achieve these benefits, you would have an adder. It avoids the complications with time of use rates, which have been mentioned in this proceeding, and also potential conflicts with statute. Vermont law currently says that net metering customers shall pay the same rates. So if there was an attempt to shift net metering customers onto a time of use rate schedule, that would conflict with this statutory requirement. I mentioned DC coupled storage here just because while it hasn't taken off or been seen much in Vermont, there may be opportunities to drop in a DC coupled storage facility and increase the capacity factor of the project, capture some of that clipped power that you would lose when the inverters are operating at max potential, without changing the AC nameplate capacity of the project, without necessarily changing your interconnect study or your interconnection impacts. And again, utility coordination, just to recognize that the utilities obviously are important partners here, and to achieve these system-wide benefits, you want to make sure that you are deploying the system at times that are advantageous for the utility. Again, there's an ongoing interconnection rule proceeding at the PUC. There are opportunities here to, rather than just dropping storage in, perhaps adopting storage-specific procedures. We want to, you want to modernize the study so you're accounting for the actual intended use. The project's not going to be charging on peak load. I mean, these are common sense changes, but under the current rule, you don't have that opportunity. And if you revise the interconnection rules, you can then unlock the ability to deploy storage in constrained areas. And lastly, just a touch on FERC Order 841. As folks probably know, this was a groundbreaking order intended to remove the barriers for storage to participate in the wholesale markets and the energy capacity of the ancillary markets. Projects as small as 100 kW can participate. And it also clarified that energy storage, even at that distribution level, even behind the meter resources, can, when they're making a purchase of energy that'll be resold in the wholesale markets, that purchase is to be at the LMP, it's to be at the wholesale price. Now that aspect in particular is the subject of an ongoing appeal to the DC Circuit, but FERC issued order on reconsideration, Order 841A, and reaffirmed its position. So that is currently the status. And not that I claim to be an expert on the energy markets in any way, but there's some implications if you decide to participate. FERC Order 841 also made clear that if you decide to participate in those markets, even those small behind-the-meter resources, 100 kW resources, you are making a jurisdictional sale. You are triggering FERC's jurisdiction. You need to be mindful of requirements that could come along with that, which could be changes in status approval and other requirements under the Federal Power Act. They may not be that onerous, but they're important to consider, because when you're developing these projects and you are financing them or you're selling them, more often than not, you have a rep and warranty that states that you are in full compliance with all applicable laws. So you want to be sure that when you make that rep, that you're being mindful of potential FERC requirements that could be looming out there because you are participating in the regulation market or offering capacity services. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right, time's running a little short, but I'm going to forego moderator's prerogative, try to fit in a few questions given the size of the crowd. I think there's a lot of interest in this topic. So if folks have questions, please raise your hands. Come on. Yes.
What do we do to change the interconnection rules in Vermont for storage so that the solar plus storage system, instead of being an interconnection that's the sum of all the inverter ratings, it's instead kind of max export to the grid rate? Are there precedents in other states, or what's the whole picture?
Do you want to come up here? Speak loudly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in interconnection, but certainly these dockets have been decided or are ongoing in all of the neighboring states. And IREC actually just came out with a really good sort of model regulation that includes storage. And a lot of it has to do with the, whether it's DC coupled or AC coupled, and then with the profile setting, right? So even if it's AC coupled, if you have some sort of limited profile setting. So I think that's something that we have to get right in Vermont, otherwise it can really inhibit deployment. And I would say too that if you look at the economics of it, I mean, and you know this, you're not going to enter into uneconomic behavior. And the most uneconomic thing to do today is to discharge both the solar and the battery at peak times, unless you have some reason to do that, and we don't in Vermont today.
Any other comments
Yeah,
on that?
just sort of related to that. There's this thing that people who are working in renewable energy like to talk about, locational value of solar. And what people generally mean by that is if you put it in certain places, it has added value to the grid because it generates locationally where you want to do so in order to avoid congestion or whatever. From the point of view of utilities, they tend to think in terms of hosting capacity, which is a totally different paradigm, which is, oh, you want to put something behind the meter? Can we accommodate that? Let's do a study and see what we have to do to increase capacity on this circuit or whatever to accommodate you, and we'll come back in a few years and let you know. And so those two kind of ways of looking at distributed resources are sometimes at odds. And when you throw storage into the mix, ideally, I think we would like storage to be viewed as helping to integrate renewables rather than adding to the problems caused by renewables as perceived by utilities. And that viewpoint is one that needs to be addressed through some of these kinds of, interconnection being an example. In Massachusetts, for example, you've got a utility, National Grid, telling customers that, yeah, you can sign up for the Smart Solar program, but we might hold you up for anywhere from 2 to 7 years while we do a study and then upgrade things so that you can actually interconnect. That's causing half of the capacity of the entire program to be put on hold. And that's why Chris just mentioned that the DPU in Massachusetts has announced an audit of National Grid. So, this is something that we need to be addressing ahead of the problem, not waiting until the problem arises, which is, let's figure out how to get utilities to recognize that storage can help solve their problems, not consider it to just be adding to their problems. And I think that's true, but we need to have a discussion about that with utilities, not just among ourselves.
And I guess within the interconnect process, I mean, you're talking about certified operational controls. You'd have contractual obligations under your interconnection agreement. It's not an it's a familiar concept. The interconnection agreements, they have ramp rate limitations. So we're just kind of building on that existing treatment to account for storage and make sure it's a realistic assessment of what the impacts could be, not a theoretical approach that evaluates something that will never actually happen.
Other questions? On the IREC model interconnection procedures that just came out that Chris mentioned, I'd like folks who are interested in this topic and the open interconnection rulemaking before the Public Utility Commission, and also recommendations to our report to take a look at those. They do address storage. They kind of admit that this is an evolving space and it's, new knowledge will emerge, but some of the recommendations in there involve looking at behind-the-meter storage that's not exporting to the grid, but operating in parallel with the distribution system. These are, IREC is a national body that's pretty well respected in the realm of these interconnection procedures. So far, the discussion has been around grid exporting storage and how to regulate it, at least in Vermont. And so now we're verging into unknown territory around non-grid exporting storage, going through an interconnection procedure, how to trigger that. So I'd love people's thoughts, particularly on that issue for our report. All right, if there's no other comments, you guys, questions, we have maybe, you guys have to get to your next session in about 5 minutes. So thank you very much, and another round of applause.